Thank you for joining me today at A Touch of Blue Studio with Drawing with Grandma. Welcome back to my studio for this next demonstration. You might remember during last week's lesson this sketchbook study that we did of this beautiful heron. We did it in pencil graphite. And during the lesson, I mentioned that I might want to do a color study of him. I thought about doing him in oil paint, but then I thought I would try a mixed media so that you can see how doing two mediums together are really kind of a fun process. So what I've decided on is watercolor with chalk pastel on top for the detail. Usually in small watercolor studies, I love to do the pencil work and do the washes of watercolor on top. But since we're going to be doing so much detail with the chalk pastel, I decided that we're going to start with just a simple sketch. But this reference of our pencil study last week was a really helpful one so that I could get familiar with his form and the shading and the development of this beautiful bird. So you can see here that I have him sketched lightly out on this watercolor paper. His head is just lightly placed and soft placement marks for the position of his body. You can see that I have a variety of brushes, even though my main brush for this study is going to be this larger brush for watercolor washes. So this is a flat wash brush, and you see I have the watercolors and my water cup just to develop nice thin washes to lay in the foundational colors. I've taped the edges so we can end up with a nice border. And I began by doing the background in just kind of a gray-blue to develop the whole surface area. But the heron itself, in the image that I'm using a photograph of a heron against this water background. So there's a lot of blue and blue-grays in the image. And so I'm going to start first with developing a wide wash over him in all the shadowed areas. But I'm trying to leave the very edges where the light is hitting him the lightest and leaving some of the paper to show through for the lightest highlights. His neck, even though is gray, there's a beautiful blue shadow on most of his neck as it turns. So I want to lay in that wash, and then we will scrub some of it up and develop some of the shadows of the feathery strands that are coming down the front of his neck and off his wings. So as you can see with watercolor, you can lay down a wash and then you can wet the area again and pick up the excess paint and scrub out the surface if you feel that it's not the right value or if it's too strong. So that's one of the really nice qualities about watercolor. So I'm looking for all of the areas that have shadow areas, that have a darker value, that when I lay down the final color, this shadow underneath will show through. Now I'm going with a watery black and gray, and in some areas there's some deep blue washed in there as well, just to kind of continue the theme of this blue-gray and just working it into that underwash. It'll bleed together. They both will be transparent. So you'll begin to see both the blue and the gray together. And hopefully they'll look a little bit united as we move forward. I still want to use washes, but I am starting to develop more of the form of his feathers and wing and the beak and that black hood on his head. But I still want to keep my strokes broad and not worry about detail at this point. I'm looking at the largest shapes of color and value, the areas where I want the attention to be most important, and then other areas that I just want suggested. The turn of the neck is very important to get the elegant position of this bird and to make sure his posture looks like it would in the wild. So I'm developing the reddish brown that is underneath him, and the legs have a basic wash in them now. And I'm going to go in with some darker values and to kind of give them some form and make sure that I can keep the highlights clean and pure. So I am using a smaller brush, but I am considering this still washes because they are just intended to bleed right into the colors that I've already laid down, and just to develop the three-dimensional illusion. I'm going to start with this fan brush though and try to work on the feathery marks that are really dominant in that wing and in the front of his body. That dark area right above where I'm working now is the really strong curve of his wing. And then his back is the one I'm working on now. So I just want to be sure you can make out the position of that wing on him. So I want to develop some texture by creating some really nice brush marks while continuing to develop some washes. I'm going to go ahead now and take off the tape so you can see the edge and how he's positioned in the picture plane. And we have a nice crisp edge now to develop him. So we're going to work on detail with the chalk pastel pencils that are really fun to work with. And we're going to focus on the yellows that are kind of foundational to the beak, the highlights, the inside of his eye. There's a little bit of orange. And you see that the blue undertone kind of work as the darker values of that yellow and orange. So hopefully the colors will work together and to create the illusion of another color underneath. So a little bit of light blue on top of that dark black hood will just help to give a little bit more depth and just the beautiful variety of colors that are really present in this specific creature. I'm using a very light gray now to unite the light area of the neck while developing some feathery marks, and to try to get that soft, smooth neck. There's a little bit more blue on top of there, just some beautiful cerulean blue and ultramarine blue mixed into that black. I'm going to start using a blender so that I can soften the chalk pastel effect on the watercolor paper. Watercolor paper has a thickness and a roughness that really needs, when you're using chalk pastels or colored pencils on it, using a blender will kind of soften it. Here we go with the blender, and it just kind of lets it work right into the watercolor and the paper surface a little bit better. So now we're widening the space, and I'm going to use the blender just to kind of smooth it all together. But I don't want to get rid of the beautiful watercolor washes. I just want to enhance and to unite the two mediums together. So we're going to just work down on his neck and chest. And then we're going to move toward finishing his body. And now using some gray. The light is hitting right there on top of his back and right against this curve of his neck. We want that to be nice and rounded and not too much angle. It's got beautiful feathery hairs flowing from his chest. A little bit of highlight. And just to bring those feathers down in front of his legs. And then finish up some detail on his head. We need to be sure that that white on his cheek is strong so that we can really make that the focal point. We could go in with another wash in the background and kind of deepen those tones. But for now, I think I'll just keep it a wash and strengthen the details of the bird a little bit more. But here he is, a finished sketch in watercolor and chalk pastel. Thank you for joining me today at A Touch of Blue Studio with Drawing and Painting with Grandma.